What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.
Good morning. The first item of business is general questions, and at question number 1, I call Finlay Carson.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it can provide an update on any discussions it's had with the UK Government regarding infrastructure.
Minister Jenni Ruth.
We meet with UK Government counterparts to discuss matters of importance to Scotland, including infrastructure, as required. I was certainly disappointed that no UK Government Minister was able to meet with me this week in London on the matter of rail infrastructure. Mr Carson may know that this has been a key feature in the ongoing Network Rail RMT dispute. It was furthermore disappointing that the UK Government's November-autumn statement did not enhance the Scottish Government's capital budget. The UK Government have failed to protect our capital allocation against inflation, pursued a hard Brexit and tight immigration laws, and presided over volatility in the financial markets. All of this is impacting on our ability to deliver on capital investment plans.
Finlay Carson.
Unfortunately, I really don't thank the Minister for that response. Last week, there was yet another horrific accident in the A75 when two HGVs lorries collided in the village of Crockett Ford. One of the vehicles overturning, hitting several parked cars, a pedestrian crossing before careering into a house. It was a miracle nobody died. Sadly, it's just another statistic, but for the people living in this small village, it's becoming all too often. I've lived next to the A75 all my life and witnessed the aftermath of hundreds of accidents, far too many resulting in the loss of life. Presiding Officer, report after report highlights the need for significant improvements on the critical link to Northern Ireland, with a bypass around Crocketford and Springholm at the top of the list. But only last week, Michael Matheson said that union connectivity had fallen off the table, only to be undermined by Jenni Ruth, who said discussions were ongoing. But this is not about party politics. The people of Dumfries and Galloway and cross-party MSPs demand these bypasses. Nothing less will be acceptable. Can the Minister confirm that positive talks with the UK Government are continuing and commit today to these bypasses so communities will not have to wait a moment longer for the much-delayed STPR2?
Minister.
So I very much recognise Mr Carson's constituency interests on this matter, and I don't think it would be appropriate for me to comment today on any one individual incident, although I am aware of the incident, of course, in question. Now, of course, my officials in Transport Scotland engage on a regular basis with their counterparts in the DFT. I am advised at the last meeting, which I think was held on the 31st of October, when the A75 was discussed, the DFT confirmed that a proposal would require to be submitted by the Scottish Government to the UK Government to approve the release of any funding for the A75. So there's no guarantee from the UK Government that any additional funding is available, and any money, of course, that might be received from the UK Government would most likely be best targeted in further investigation of preliminary options for a local bypass, as I think Mr Carson alluded to, of Springholm and Crocketford, and that has been identified through the SCPR2 process. But of course it would be for Transport Scotland to lead and manage this work because the trunk road network belongs to Scottish ministers. And irrespective, I have not received any substantive update from the Chancellor on this matter. It would be much more appropriate. I hear Mr Carson heckling from a sedentary position. I have to say this is potential, and my officials have been informed.
Minister, can I just remind members that the only person speaking should be the person who is asking a question or responding? And can I ask too that we pick up the pace because we have a lot of interest in this item? Thank you.
I've received no substantive update from the Chancellor or any other UK Government Minister on this matter. It would be far more appropriate for the UK Government to protect and enhance Scotland's capital allocation to reflect rising inflation. And finally, Presiding Officer, as Mr Carson knows, transport infrastructure investment decisions are devolved to Scotland. So if his friends in the UK Government want to increase funding to infrastructure projects in Scotland, then they should do so through the already agreed and established processes of devolution.
Question number 2, James Dornan.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on any recent engagement that it's had with the energy sector regarding support for those at risk of fuel poverty.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
The First Minister has chaired 2 energy summits since August this year, where all major energy suppliers have attended, along with advice providers and third sector organisations. The summits have discussed the impact of the measures introduced by the UK Government in response to the energy crisis and agreed that the UK Government should be targeting more support towards those living within vulnerable circumstances. Other outcomes include the Scottish Government commitment to work with the public and private sector partners to explore how those living in fuel poverty can be further protected within our devolved powers.
James Dornan.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. At the last summit, the Scottish Government agreed to work with Energy UK and other organisations to increase smart meter coverage in Scotland. And whilst aspects of smart meter usage are helpful, the Minister will be aware of the shocking and frankly immoral actions of energy companies who are using smart meters as a backdoor to switch consumers to prepay mode, often on a more expensive tariff, without informing people or having to apply for a warrant. And that this has already happened to over 150,000 households, with Ofgem estimating a further 180,000 households will be affected this winter. Can he say how many households in Scotland this has happened to, and whether this is in fact legal, given that previously companies would have had to apply to the Scottish courts for a warrant before taking such action?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, although I can't give an exact figure, we are aware of instances where energy suppliers have switched their customers' accounts to prepayment mode without informing them first or obtaining a warrant beforehand. This can have quite serious implications for customers, particularly those living in vulnerable circumstances. We would certainly condemn this kind of practice, as it's likely to exacerbate the challenges that some households in fuel poverty will already be contending with. I've asked my officials to engage with Ofgem directly on this matter and to look for action to be taken. In the meantime, I would like to reassure members that if they do have a constituent who is affected by this, that they can seek advice through our advice services, primarily through Advice Direct Scotland.
Mercedes Vialba.
The UK's major energy distributors made £15.8 billion in profits last year, despite rising energy bills putting more consumers at risk of fuel poverty. Unite the Union is calling on Ofgem to reopen its price review and set a clear cap on the distributors' profits. Will the Minister join Unite in urging Ofgem to act now to end this rampant profiteering?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Presiding Officer, I certainly do support the need to make sure that we are taking a fair tax return from those who are making excessive profits within our energy sector and energy companies in particular. But I would just gently point out to the member is that we are in a situation where we are seeing energy companies making record profits. Scotland, one of the most energy-rich nations in Europe, but actually has one of the highest levels of fuel poverty in the whole of Europe. Rather than actually writing to UK Government ministers, pleading with Ofgem to take action over these matters, I prefer to have the powers here in this Parliament to tackle these matters so that we can tax these companies properly and we can end fuel poverty once and for all in energy-rich Scotland.
Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Some of my constituents are experiencing significant delays in having faulty meters replaced or repaired as energy companies have contracted out this work to third parties. Already impacted by high levels of fuel poverty, they face increased anxiety about their bills. Our island areas are also experiencing market failure in new electricity contracts for both business and domestic consumers. Has the Scottish Government had any discussions with the energy sector about these serious problems?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, we raise these issues and these types of issues on a regular basis with Ofgem and also with the UK Government, who are ultimately responsible for these matters, including issues relating to energy meters and also the failures in the market and the regulation of the market, which are evident and actually adding to fuel poverty and the very high increases that people are facing in their fuel bills. Now, if the member has some specific examples that she wants us to ensure are highlighted to Ofgem, I'm more than happy to receive that information and make sure that we forward it on to Ofgem and ask them to take urgent action addressing these matters.
Question number 3, Jenni Minto.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what recent dialogue it has had with the UK Government regarding the potential impact on Scotland of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill.
Cabinet Secretary Angus Robertson.
I met with the Foreign Secretary 2 weeks ago and urged the UK Government to seize the current window of opportunity to re-engage in good faith with our European partners, seek sustainable shared solutions on the Northern Ireland Protocol and to withdraw the bill without delay. The bill risks violating international law and sparking a trade conflict with our European Union neighbours in the middle of a cost of living crisis with potentially disastrous consequences for Scotland and the whole of the UK. This is simply indefensible.
Jenni Minto.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. In the SEAC Committee report on the legislative consent memorandum for the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, the committee reiterated its view that the extent of UK ministers' new delegated powers in devolved areas amounts to a significant constitutional change. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that to ensure that the Scottish Parliament has the opportunity to effectively exercise legislative powers to ensure Scotland is a fairer, greener and progressive country, the real constitutional change required is for Westminster to keep its promise of 2014 that power lies with the Scottish people to decide how Scotland is governed and grant a Section 30?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, indeed, it would be far better for the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government to be able to make decisions in this area. And in general terms, people in Scotland, of course, have made a clear decision to be offered the choice about this country's future in a referendum. And we call on the UK Government to respect that decision, to open discussions with the Scottish Government on a change to the Scottish Parliament's powers so it can be given effect to the mandate of the people of Scotland in the Scottish parliamentary elections last year. And the easiest route to do this would be through a Section 30 order.
Thank you. Question 4 is not lodged. Question 5, Ruth Maguire.
To ask the Scottish Government how citizens can influence energy consent planning decisions made under the Section 36 application process.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
Citizens are able to engage in the planning process by making representation to Scottish ministers on live Section 36 applications. Measures are in place throughout the planning and consenting process to ensure that views from the public are taken into account when decisions are made. Guidance is available to encourage applicants to undertake early and meaningful engagement with citizens who would be affected by a proposed Section 36 application.
Ruth Maguire.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. I recently met with constituents in Lylestone who told me that they feel they're in a David and Goliath scale fight with a company proposing to build a large solar farm on farmland next to their village. They expressed worry and anger that the company concerned is acting as if the project is a foregone conclusion. I seek reassurance from the Scottish Government that this is absolutely not the case and that concerns and objections of residents of the village who'd be most impacted by the proposed development will be taken seriously and acted on.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Planning and Electricity Act application process has a very clear mechanism within it to ensure communities and members of the public can have their say when proposals are submitted. Ministers and, of course, the planning authorities carefully consider all views which are submitted and considered during the application process. The merits of each proposal are considered on their own individual merits on a case-by-case basis and are carefully balanced against a range of different matters that have to be taken into account, including environmental, economic, renewable energy and climate change benefits. The purpose of this is to ensure that communities do have an opportunity to feed into this process, and I hope that provides reassurance to the members' constituents and it is an open and transparent process for doing so.
Question number 6, Alec Rowley.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what action it's taken to address the reported decline in numbers of National 5 and higher pupils taking STEM subjects in schools.
Cabinet Secretary Shirley-Anne Somerville.
We are committed to encouraging young people's ambitions to pursue STEM subjects. The evidence tells us that they continue to do so, with the percentage of STEM entries at higher and National 5 stable this year compared to 2019, when the last year in which exams were held. Since 2017, we've been implementing our STEM strategy, which includes work to ensure ongoing take-up of STEM subjects. For example, the work with organisations such as Raising the Aspirations in Science Education to equip practitioners with the skills, networks and confidence to deliver engaging STEM experiences, and also our continue to support for the Young STEM Leaders programme.
Alec Rowley.
Presiding Officer, we could trade back and forward a whole load of statistics, but I would hope the Cabinet Secretary would agree that we're not doing good enough when it comes to Scottish education and we need to do better. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary specifically whether she will agree that we need to prioritise, firstly, by sorting out the teachers' dispute? It's absolutely shocking that these teachers who have been through so much are finding themselves having to be forced onto picket lines to defend their pay and their jobs. And secondly, would she agree that we need to have every local authority in Scotland, education authority, bring forward proper costed recovery plans so that these can be scrutinised by democratically elected councillors at a local level and by this Parliament, so that we can start to address the massive failings in Scottish education?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm afraid I don't recognise the picture that Mr Rowley is painting of Scottish education, and I think that is to be proven in the work that is ongoing in the national discussion, when we are told that there is a lot that is successful and that is good in Scottish education. So while I appreciate we must always look to see how we can do better, I think it would be advisable if we also recognise what is going well and the good position that we are in at the moment. We are, of course, continuing to liaise with all teaching unions around the current pay dispute. That work is ongoing. Industrial action is in no one's best interest, particularly that of children and young people. And of course, we are also very close to the publication of the stretch aims as part of our Scottish Attainment Challenge, which are set by local authorities specifically to look at what is being done in each local authority to ensure that we are very carefully looking at attainment within the councils.
Audrey Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I recently attended a Girls in Energy conference hosted by an energy operator and their college partners that supports girls to undertake a one-year course in S4 and provides a platform to pursue a career in energy. So given the sector is still considered to be male-dominated, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what action the Scottish Government is taking to maximise opportunities for girls and women to pursue educational pathways and a career in STEM?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Audrey Nicholl for that important question and a challenge that we must all rise to increase not just the number of pupils that are interested in STEM, but particularly young women as well. I absolutely recognise the contribution that girls in energy have, the courses that they support in Audrey Nicholl's constituency. And this is very much integral to our work within the STEM strategy, ensuring that equality is absolutely an important part, and that is exactly why Education Scotland, for example, continues to work with improving gender balance in the equalities team to look at that.
Sue Webber.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, the declining number of pupils taking STEM subjects at Nat 5 and higher appears to have coincided with a drop in applications to study medicine. UCAS figures show that 19% fewer Scots have applied to study medicine for the 2023 academic year than in the past 2 years. Is the Cabinet Secretary concerned that not only is there a drop in pupils studying STEM, but there is also a drop in the number of Scots applying to study medicine?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, if I can perhaps point to the original answer that I gave to Alec Rowley about the entry and attainment will inevitably vary from individual subjects, but that's why I answered with an overall percentage of STEM entries. It is particularly important to recognise that there are a number of new STEM subjects out there, so mathematics is also joined by the application of mathematics and biology by human biology. So we take very seriously our desire to increase the number of pupils that are taking STEM subjects, and then, of course, whether it's medicine or otherwise, to encourage young people to take forward an opportunity within our colleges, within apprenticeships and with universities with STEM as the basis of that subject.
Question number 7, Jeremy Balfour.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government whether it plans to ban the installation of replacement fossil fuel boilers from 2025.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
The Scottish Government published its Heating Building Strategy in October 2021, which set out how we propose to remove emissions from Scotland's buildings by 2045, in line with the country's climate change targets. As committed to in this year's programme for government, the Scottish Government will consult on in details on proposals for a heating buildings bill in the coming year. This will include further detail on how we propose to phase out the use of fossil fuel heating systems from 2025, as committed to in our strategy.
Jeremy Balfour.
Presiding Officer, for people making decisions now about heating their home, we should be able to have a clear idea from the Government about how impending regulations will impact them. However, key messages about what we have to do to their homes to make them compliant are not being relayed. Instead, the Government continues to make vague suggestions of what regulations might look like. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell concerned homeowners when they can expect comprehensive details of what regulations will come into place from 2025 regarding the need for replacement boilers?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Presiding Officer, if the member's looking for concrete examples, he just needs to look at the strategy, because the strategy sets out that the early action in off-grid is actually focused in 2025 on those who are off-grid gas supplied at the present moment, and by 2030 for those who are on-grid in gas supplies. So the strategy sets that out very clearly, and I hope the member will share that information with his concerned constituents. The statutory regulations which will underpin that will be brought forward in the draft bill, which will be consulted on, which will set out the details in regulation. So I hope that provides the clarity that the member is looking for, as it is set out in the strategy, which was published last October.
Thank you. That concludes general questions. The next item of business is First Minister's questions, and at question number 1, I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by paying tribute to the incredible life and legacy of Doddy Weir, who sadly passed away on Saturday. During his fight to find a cure for motor neuron disease, Doddy has been an inspiration to all of us with his bravery, his infectious optimism and his love of life. And my thoughts are with Doddy's wife Cathy, their sons Hamish, Angus and Ben, and their wider family and friends. Scotland has lost a true sporting legend and a champion in the fight against motor neuron disease. Presiding Officer, in the last week, a United Nations expert on violence against women offered to provide expertise to the First Minister on the Gender Recognition Bill. Rima Salim raised concerns that the bill would potentially open up the door for violent males to abuse the process of acquiring a gender certificate. Her report states, and I quote, "This presents potential risks to the safety of women in all their diversity, including women born female, trans women and gender non-conforming women." Last night, the Scottish Conservatives asked Parliament to simply acknowledge the report of the UN Rapporteur, but the First Minister voted against it. First Minister, why can't you accept the concerns raised by the United Nations Special Rapporteur?
First Minister.
Firstly, Presiding Officer, can I also take the opportunity to pay tribute to the life and legacy of Doddy Weir? He was a hero on the rugby pitch, but he was perhaps even more so an inspiration off of the rugby pitch. There is, of course, a question later in this session of FMQs that will allow me to pay more fulsome tribute to Doddy, but for now, let me say that my thoughts and condolences are with his wife, children and all of his loved ones. On the specific issue, not only do we acknowledge the comments made, it's not a UN report, these were comments by a UN Special Rapporteur. Not only have we acknowledged that those comments have been made, the Cabinet Secretary has written a substantial response to them. I believe that response can be found on the Scottish Parliament website because it was sent to the Equalities Committee, which of course is the lead committee on this bill. Of course, a number of organisations representing women who suffer male violence and abuse, including Rape Crisis Scotland and Scottish Women's Aid, have been part of a number of organisations who have responded as well and have set out in a number of respects why they disagree with those comments. I take the safety of women and girls very seriously, perhaps more seriously than any other issue, as I'm sure all of us do. I've spent much of my adult life and indeed all of my years in public office seeking to do things along with others to help advance the rights of women and girls and to ensure better protection for women and girls against male violence. Of course, any man who wants to abuse a woman, certainly in my experience, and I think this will be shared by many across the chamber, do not need to in some way pretend to be a woman in order to do so. And any who did feel that need, of course, don't need a gender recognition certificate. Our focus as a parliament, our focus as a society, should be on those who perpetrate violence against women and girls, and that is men. Not all men, of course, but it is men who abuse women, and that should be our focus. In taking on these issues and debating these issues fully and respectfully, which I believe is really important, what we should not do, in my view, is further stigmatise a group in society, a very small minority in society, who are already perhaps the most marginalised and stigmatised group in society. I'm of course talking about trans people. In any group of society where there are bad faith actors, we deal with them. We don't stigmatise the entire group, and I believe that very strongly as well.
Douglas Ross.
I'm not then sure from the First Minister's answer why she couldn't have voted for the Conservative amendment yesterday, which simply asked Parliament to acknowledge that report from the Special Rapporteur, which the Cabinet Secretary has responded to, yet the First Minister and the majority of SNP MSPs couldn't support that. But let's just have a look at the valid concerns that have been raised by this expert. Reem Assalim says, and I quote, "The efforts to reform existing legislation by the Scottish Government do not sufficiently take into consideration the specific needs of women and girls, particularly those at risk of male violence and those who have experienced male violence. To prevent the risk of attacks on women, my Scottish Conservative colleague Russell Finlay submitted an amendment to ban convicted sex offenders from changing gender. But the Scottish Government voted that amendment down. So why does the First Minister believe that a convicted male sex offender should be able to change their gender when there is a risk that they will exploit the system to attack women?
First Minister.
Firstly, not only has the Cabinet Secretary responded in detail to the comments of the Special Rapporteur, and I would encourage all members and all members of the public with an interest here to read those comments, because it sets out very clearly why, respectfully, we do not believe that these concerns are well-founded, and that sets out the reasons for that very fully and very clearly. The Cabinet Secretary will also meet with the Special Rapporteur next week to discuss these concerns in more detail. And of course, this is a bill that has not only gone through 2 public consultations, is currently going through very extensive parliamentary scrutiny. And in terms of stage... In terms of stage 2 of the bill, a number of amendments have been passed and that has responded to a number of the concerns that have been raised with members across all sides of this chamber. There are some amendments that the Cabinet Secretary will have set out again very fully and very clearly to the committee why the government could not support those amendments and the reasons for that. And of course it's for the committee then to vote and to decide on these matters, and ultimately it will be for this Parliament as a whole to reach decisions at stage 3, which of course we will reach before the end of this parliamentary session. These are difficult issues that people have that have strong views on different aspects of this. I think it's really important that we engage seriously, that we engage respectfully, that we engage in detail, and that we remember all of us see protecting women and girls as a priority, but I hope all of us also see protecting the rights of trans people as important too. And actually, I feel that part of my duty is to set out clearly why I do not believe, having considered in great depth all of these issues over a long period of time, why I do not believe these objectives are conflicting. In fact, I believe that it is important we advance both of these things, and that is what the government is seeking to do.
Douglas Ross. I agree with the First Minister that we have to treat this with the seriousness and respect it deserves and look into detail with these things. But again, I asked a very simple question as to why the government couldn't support Russell Finlay's amendment, and we got no answer on that. I think we should surely all be able to agree that convicted male sex offenders should never be able to change their gender. This is not about trans people. These people are criminals, and that is exactly what Russell Finlay was trying to stop. But the First Minister is also trying to say that the government has dealt with this issue, but the UN expert says differently. The Special Rapporteur said this: "The Scottish Government does not spell out how it will ensure a level of scrutiny for the applications made to acquire a gender recognition certificate. Other governments that have adopted a self-identification procedure for the legal recognition of a gender identity have done so." So other governments did the necessary work before changing the law, but the First Minister hasn't. And right now, there are live court cases that could have a material impact on this bill. The UN expert says the government should, as a minimum, await the outcome of the judgments on these very issues in front of both Scottish and UK courts. So the First Minister said this bill is currently going through extensive scrutiny. Therefore, surely, First Minister, you must agree to pause the bill until we've heard these legal judgments.
First Minister. It's ultimately for Parliament to determine whether or not a bill passes through this chamber. On the issue of sex offenders, let me set out in more detail the reasoning for the government's position on that particular amendment. Current provisions for management of sex offenders are robust and effective. However, we will expand, and this has been made clear during stage 2, we will expand the reporting requirements to include notification about an application for gender recognition. It's important to point out that under the existing process in the 2004 Gender Recognition Act, there is no requirement that an applicant must be what that amendment would have required. And the amendments lodged by Russell Finlay, our consideration is that they would not be compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. So while we think that the processes for sex offender notification requirements are already working well, notwithstanding that, the Scottish Government has made clear that before the Gender Recognition Reform Bill is commenced, we will introduce legislation to amend the sex offender notification requirements to include notification about an application for a gender recognition certificate. So we are taking these issues seriously, but we are seeking to proceed in a way that will ensure the bill is compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights. And we have been open to other amendments put forward, including by Jamie Green, a member of the Conservative group. On the comments of the Special Rapporteur, we take these seriously. That is why we have responded in detail. But respectfully, we do not believe that those criticisms are well-founded. And that's not a view that we hold alone. Organisations that work day in and day out with women and girls
Briefly,
who are
First Minister.
subject to male violence. Rape Crisis Scotland, Scottish Women's Aid also believe that many of these criticisms and concerns are not well-founded. So we'll continue to proceed carefully. There has been considerable consultation and considerable scrutiny of this bill, and that is right and proper.
Douglas Ross.
On the First Minister's response on sex offenders, we know as a result of a Scottish Conservative Freedom of Information request that in the last 3 years in Scotland, more than 500 times a sex offender has changed their name. So if they can change their name so easily and for the reasons they want to, why would they not also change their gender if this now becomes easier as a result of this legislation? I also asked, and I know and I understand this was a complex issue, and the First Minister didn't mention the point about the live legal cases that are currently ongoing, for which the Special Rapporteur asked for this legislation to be delayed. Those judgments are crucial, and a delay would be sensible. It is far better that this government and this Parliament makes good laws rather than quick laws. We want to make legislation with full and proper consideration of all of the implications. But for some reason, the government seems determined to rush ahead at full speed to put this bill through this month. The experts and women's groups say could have potentially damaging consequences. Now, the First Minister said the Special Rapporteur's criticisms are not well formed. Rima Salim is a United Nations expert. She is a Special Rapporteur on violence against women and girls. I personally think very few people can speak with greater authority on women's safety. The Scottish Parliament, including the committee in charge of scrutinising this bill, has not had the chance to examine her evidence and hear from her in person, which the Cabinet Secretary will be doing. So will the First Minister agree today to pause this legislation so we can properly consider the findings of a leading global expert on this crucial matter?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I cannot comment on live legal cases and would be open to criticism if I did. Secondly, regardless of any individual's view on this legislation, one thing that cannot be said with any credibility or basis in fact is that it is being rushed through this Parliament. This process, through consultation, introduction of draft legislation, introduction of legislation, the formal parliamentary scrutiny process has been underway now, I think, for a period of 6 years. This has not been rushed. This has been done carefully and rightly so. Let me respond before I come on to, again, the issue of the UN Special Rapporteur, to the issue about registered sex offenders. It is the case already that registered sex offenders must by law notify the police of any change of name. That requirement applies to an individual irrespective of what name they use or what gender they identify with, and that is important. Disclosure Scotland takes steps already to ensure that a person requesting a disclosure certificate does not succeed in avoiding the disclosure of any previous convictions by using a different name. So it's important to recognise the protections that are already in place, that this bill does nothing to change. And many of the issues that are being talked about here, and many of the issues that are sparking concern, I accept, are not issues that are changed or impacted in any way by the detail of this specific legislation. Now, coming back to the Special Rapporteur, it is because we respect that person and the role they hold that we are treating these concerns so seriously. The response, and again I would encourage every member to read the Cabinet Secretary's response on the Parliament's website. Cabinet Secretary will meet the UN Special Rapporteur next week. But there are other voices in this debate that also speak from a lot of experience and expertise, and it's not right to dismiss them either, because they are people who work with women that are subject to male violence every single day of the week. Lastly, Presiding Officer, Given that we are speaking about a UN Special Rapporteur, the reforms in this bill align with the stated position of the UN Human Rights Office that trans people should be recognised legally, and I'm quoting, through a simple administrative process that does not require medical diagnosis. And lastly, Presiding Officer, Scotland is not the first country in the world to make changes of this nature. Many other countries have done so, and as the Cabinet Secretary's response to the UN Special Rapporteur sets out, the concerns that are being raised in the context of our legislation have not materialised in the experience of other countries who are ahead of us. So let's continue to treat these issues seriously, respectfully and calmly, and allow Parliament to continue to do its job properly.
Question number 2, Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to join others in paying tribute to the late Doddy Weir. It was clear throughout his life, both as a player and a campaigner, that he was a force to be reckoned with. He viewed his heartbreaking diagnosis of motor neuron disease as a call to action and bravely shared his story with the world, raising millions of pounds for that cause. He was an inspiration to us all and a champion for those battling MND. And our thoughts are with his family and friends at this difficult time. Presiding Officer, breast cancer chemotherapy in NHS Tayside has collapsed, leaving vulnerable women travelling across the country to receive life-saving treatment. At the root of the problem is a chemotherapy dosing scandal that has gone on for 3.5 years. Yesterday, the Courier released a documentary where the women affected and grieving families demanded answers. We now know that nobody believes the conclusions of the reports commissioned by the First Minister's government. Patients don't believe them, the doctors don't believe them, and even the whistleblower who first raised the alarm described the conclusions of the reports as nothing more than a guess. For years, Labour has raised this issue and been dismissed by this government. So will the First Minister order an independent inquiry to restore confidence, to relaunch the service and give patients and the public the facts they need?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, before responding to the very serious issues that have been raised, can I say, first of all, that Anna Sarwar is wrong to describe the Tayside service as having collapsed. That neither comes close to accurately describing the current service, nor does it do anything to help any current patients or the dedicated doctors that are working within that centre. And let me illustrate that point, because it is a really important point for those, particularly those in Tayside who might be watching this right now. There are around 150 new patients referred to Tayside breast services every week. Out of them, around 7 will receive treatment in another centre. So it is just wrong, and I think shamefully wrong, to use the word collapsed to describe a service in which doctors are working in a dedicated fashion, in which many patients are being treated every single week. In terms of the issues about the review, these are serious issues. These are issues that require to be assessed by experts and by clinicians. I am not, and politicians are not clinicians with the expertise to reach judgments ourselves on these matters. I will look carefully at what has been reported today, as will the Health Secretary, and if there is a further process of review that is necessary, we will not shy away from taking that. The RCP review commissioned by NHS Tayside into prescribing practices up to early 2020 happened. The board will be implementing all of its recommendation. That review looked at a random selection of case notes from before and after the HIS review and confirmed variation in practice against national norms, as the HIS review had already found, but pointed to a range of improvements in practice since then. And the authors of that RCP review included 4 oncologists, and of course its findings aligned with previous published reviews, including that of Healthcare Improvement Scotland. So we will continue to take these issues seriously, but we will also do so responsibly.
Anna Sarwar.
I would suggest the First Minister actually watches the documentary and listens to the stories of staff at NHS Tayside and the experiences of families. There are 0 breast cancer oncologists in Tayside. 0. If 0 doesn't equate to collapse, then I'm not sure what definition the First Minister would use. And this does have consequences for staff. There is a workforce crisis across our NHS, but particularly felt here in Tayside. A recent Freedom of Information request showed there are 9 vacancies in the oncology department, with the lead breast cancer consultant post now vacant for 839 days. That has consequences for patients too. Over 200 women have had to travel to other parts of the country to get their treatment. In February, the First Minister said this was unacceptable, but since then things are getting worse. The government's failure to get a grip of this crisis is putting women's lives at risk. At one of the most traumatic times in a woman's life, they are facing additional barriers to treatment and all the anxiety that comes with that. So can the First Minister tell us when local oncology services will be restored, and can she guarantee that breast cancer oncology services have a future in Tayside?
First Minister.
Well, Anna Sarwar asked about watching the documentary. I will certainly take the time to do that, but the Health Secretary hasn't just watched the documentary, he took part in the documentary. These issues are issues that all of us take seriously. The Cabinet Secretary is meeting with the current clinical teams next week, and let me take the opportunity to assure patients in Tayside that they have a very committed and compassionate team of doctors that deliver excellent care. Recruitment efforts are ongoing, and indeed there has been recent success in recruiting a consultant in colorectal cancer in Tayside. Tayside NHS, though, works closely with oncology teams in the other 4 cancer centres across Scotland to ensure that patients who need treatment are prioritised appropriately. And let me repeat what I said in my original answer. Yes, there are challenges in the Tayside service. Yes, there have been reviews that have been necessary. If there are further reviews, we will not shy away from those, and there is further work to be done. But 150 new patients referred to Tayside breast services every week, and of them just 7 have to go to another centre to receive treatment. So it does a disservice not to raise these issues. It is absolutely right to raise these issues, but it does do a disservice to those working in that centre to describe it as being in a state of collapse, because that is not the case.
Anna Sarwar.
First Minister, the women in Tayside don't want to see the Health Secretary in a documentary. They want to see a breast cancer oncologist in Tayside. And that problem has still not been fixed. And I'm sorry, but the First Minister has said little today that will reassure women in Tayside and their families. We do have a failing cancer service, and that means staff are being let down, women are being let down, and a First Minister who has no serious plan to restore services. And as per usual, Nicola Sturgeon keeps telling us that it is unacceptable, but then expects patients to accept it anyway. And we've seen it again this week. Ambulances still queuing at A&Es. Elderly patients still waiting on trolleys for treatment. The longest waiting lists in history. Now over 750,000 Scots on an NHS waiting list. And women in Tayside being failed by the collapse of cancer services. First Minister, you are in charge of the NHS in Scotland, and you have been for 15 years. How long do Scots have to wait before you get to grips with this crisis and actually do your job?
First Minister.
I am in charge, as head of this government, of the National Health Service, which is why I understand that running the National Health Service, that resolving challenges and problems in the National Health Service takes more than glib soundbites in the chamber of the Scottish Parliament. And as they have been throughout the entirety of the 15 years that my party has been in government, the people of Scotland will be the ultimate and indeed the only judge of whether or not this government is trusted to continue with its stewardship of the National Health Service. All of these issues are taken seriously. It was because of original concerns about potentially substandard care that many of these issues came to the fore. And I repeat again what I said. There is work to do here to ensure the sustainability and the ongoing quality of cancer care and breast cancer care in NHS Tayside. But the vast overwhelming majority of those referred into that service do not go for treatment to another centre. They get quality treatment in NHS Tayside. And I say it again, it does a disservice to that service to suggest otherwise. And in terms of the wider points, again, day in and day out, this government works to address the significant challenges that our NHS is under. So if we look at the If we look at the statistics published just this week, significant increase in the number of inpatient and day case patients seen in the last quarter, a 7.3% increase. The referral to treatment target, an increase in the number, the percentage of those seen within 18 weeks, 72.5%, and reductions of the longest waits in our National Health Service, a 20% reduction in outpatients and a 22% reduction for inpatient and day cases. So we will continue to do the hard work of supporting our NHS through these difficult times, because that's our job, that's our responsibility, a responsibility given to us by the people of Scotland.
Question number 3, Gillian Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As others have, I want to add the thoughts of my party to the tributes paid here to Dodie Weir. His legacy will not just be his rugby, but will be the honesty and bravery with which he faced his health condition and the incredible work he did in raising awareness and funding. I send the most sincere and heartfelt condolences to his family. Their bravery has never failed to astound me, and his sons in particular have been in my thoughts this week. It's awful to lose a parent, and they're so young. They've been amazing in accompanying their dad to events over the last few years, and I hope the whole family are getting the support they need. To ask the Scottish Government whether it recognises the harms caused by alcohol sports sponsorship to vulnerable groups such as young people and those in recovery.
First Minister.
Well, it is the case that alcohol advertising and promotion can encourage young people to drink alcohol and indeed act as a barrier for those in recovery. Restricting alcohol advertising and promotion is one of the World Health Organisation's 3 best buys to prevent and reduce alcohol-related harms. We have launched a public consultation setting out potential restrictions on a variety of methods of alcohol advertising, including on sports sponsorship. This consultation closes on the 9th of March next year, and I would encourage anyone with an interest to respond. The Minister for Public Health will meet with key stakeholders, including sporting bodies, during the consultation period to hear about potential impacts and their views on these proposals.
Gillian Mackay.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. It is well established that exposure to alcohol marketing is causally associated with the initiation of drinking, an increase in alcohol consumption and also an increased risk of relapse for those in recovery. Sports sponsorship provides alcohol companies with a prominent and highly attractive method of reaching a large audience, influencing how much and how often they consume alcohol. Does the Scottish Government recognise the need to implement restrictions on alcohol sports sponsorship as a public health measure to protect our population?
First Minister.
I think I said, and I would repeat what I said in my original answer, that I think it is an important aspect of promoting better public health and, of course, discouraging young people from drinking alcohol and making it more difficult for people with alcohol misuse issues to recover from those. In terms of sporting organisations, there are difficult issues involved. Of course, we would encourage sporting organisations to diversify sponsorship away from the alcohol industry. I think it's because I do agree very much with the comments that Gillian Mackay has made that we have embarked on this consultation. There are some complex issues involved in it, but it's important that we listen to a wide range of people and, of course, key stakeholders, which we will do. This government has a good record in implementing sometimes controversial policies, minimum pricing for alcohol, to try to reduce the harm that we know alcohol can do. And that's the spirit in which we will take forward this consultation.
Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. If the Government is seeking to curtail the advertisement of any perceived enjoyment of drinking, then surely it must also raise public awareness of the harms of drinking as well, especially at this time of year. We know that drinking under the influence offences have risen by 20% over the last decade, yet last year the conviction rate for those offences fell by a third year on year. Many cases are simply being dropped due to delays in forensic testing. As we enter the festive period, aside from Police Scotland's own public awareness campaign as to around the dangers of drinking and driving, what is the Scottish Government doing itself to raise awareness of this important issue? And does the First Minister agree that these conviction rates are simply far too low?
First Minister.
Firstly, we all recognise that drinking alcohol in moderation is something that many people do and enjoy doing. What we need to discourage and what we need to address are people who have a problem of alcohol misuse or drink alcohol in ways that pose a danger to them and to others. Obviously, conviction rates for any offence are a matter for the courts and the independent prosecution authorities. Of course, I want to make sure that the government is doing everything to raise awareness, and we will, as we approach this festive season, as we do every year and beyond, take steps to continue to educate people about the dangers of driving under the influence of alcohol and drugs, of course. But in terms of making sure that people who do that are identified and prosecuted, that's a matter for the independent authorities. But we want to ensure that we have a zero tolerance to that, and the government will continue to support those independent authorities in all ways that are appropriate.
Question number 4, Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what impact any proposed reduction in the number of overseas student visas will have on Scottish universities.
First Minister.
Scotland's universities, world-class universities, do a fantastic job of attracting students from around the world, and that should be welcomed. The UK Government, unfortunately, seems intent on jeopardising the internationalist outlook of our tertiary sector, as its policies continue to make it seem, at least, that the UK is not a welcoming place for people to come to live, work and study. I want to be absolutely clear that international students make a valuable contribution to our campuses, to our society, culture and indeed to our economy. Every year, I think more than 60,000 students from around 180 countries study in Scotland, and we should continue to welcome and encourage that.
Gillian Martin.
Thank the First Minister for that answer, and the proposals that seem to be outlined by the Prime Minister seem at odds with the positive aspects of universities that she's just outlined. Universities UK, which represents most Scottish universities, said that international students make a net positive contribution of £25.9 billion to the UK economy and are the source of 70% of education export earnings. Can the First Minister give an initial assessment of the economic impact any reduction in student visas from the UK Government could have on Scotland's economy? And in a time where Tory and Labour-backed Brexit has already had a devastating impact on research collaboration between our Scottish universities and their EU counterparts, how might this also impact remaining international collaborations? And crucially, what can we do in Scotland to safeguard our universities from reckless UK plans like this?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, restricting the ability of international students to come to study in Scotland will have an adverse impact on our education institutions, I think on our society, which is more diverse and vibrant because of that contribution, and it will have an adverse impact on our economy as well. I mean, let me just quote the Director of Universities Scotland when he said very recently, in recent days, any attempts to cut international student numbers at Scottish universities would be damaging to universities and the Scottish economy. Every year, more than 65,000 students from more than 180 countries study in Scotland. This diversity brings significant advantages to both our students and the wider university community, as well as generating a £1.94 billion net contribution to the Scottish economy. That is why we need to do everything we can to make it possible for people to come to live, work and study in Scotland. Brexit is making that more difficult, as it is making many things more difficult, and we need to find a way back into the heart of the European Union. And to answer Gillian Martin's last question, the only way now for Scotland to do that, given the Tories, Labour and the Liberals seem to support the UK being outside of the European Union, the only way for Scotland to get back in is by becoming an independent member of the European Union.
Question number 5, Jeremy Balfour.
Presiding Officer, to ask the First Minister how the Scottish Government will mark the United Nations International Day of Persons with Disabilities.
First Minister.
The UN International Day of Persons with Disabilities is a very important day. It highlights that disabled people continue to experience inequality and barriers. As a mark of respect for the day and to help promote it, the Scottish Government will be lighting up St Andrew's House and Victoria Quay in purple. We also provide £5 million to support disabled people's organisations to tackle inequality and discrimination and promote the rights of disabled people. And of course, we've committed to incorporating the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities into Scots law. All of us, I know, want to ensure that disabled people benefit from all that we are doing to improve the lives of people and to achieve equality for all.
Jeremy Balfour.
Can I thank the First Minister for a very positive answer? First Minister, I am lodging my final proposal to establish a Disability Commissioner for Scotland next Tuesday, an individual who will act as a champion for the disabled community, for all disabled people. What better way to celebrate International Day of Persons with Disabilities than by you committing to supporting my proposal? Will your government support it?
First Minister. I do want to try and give a positive answer here. Of course, we need to see the detail and the consultation responses when those are published and see the detail of the bill when it's introduced. As I've said in other contexts, it's not possible for any government to give a commitment to support a bill before it's actually seen the bill. But I know the Equalities Minister has agreed to meet with Mr Balfour to establish the details of the proposals, and we will certainly look as favourably as we can on that, because I absolutely recognise the sentiments behind the proposals for a Disability Commissioner. In saying that, though, I think it's also important, and I'm sure Jeremy Balfour would share these views too, that we need to underline and remind people that there are existing commissions to support and protect the rights of disabled people. The Scottish Human Rights Commission, the UK Equality and Human Rights Commission already play a role in relation to the rights of disabled people and in respect of that of age as a protected equality characteristic. So there are existing mechanisms, but of course we should consider fully the proposal for a Disability Commissioner that I know the member will shortly bring forward.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In 2018, Scope found that disabled people in Scotland spent on average £632 a month on disability-related expenses, things like taxis, increased use of heating, special equipment and care costs. 1 in 5 disabled adults face additional costs of over £1,000, and almost a quarter of families with disabled children are facing similar costs. Given the current cost of living crisis, will the Scottish Government consider commissioning an update to this research?
First Minister.
Yes, I'm happy to give that consideration. I also recognise the reality for people with disabilities that Pam Duncan-Glancy has narrated in the Chamber today. And of course, we have already taken steps to implement a Fairer Scotland for Disabled People, the strategy that we have had in place. So over the 5 years of that delivery plan, we have, for example, increased the number involved in choosing and controlling social care support through self-directed support. We have also seen Fair Start Scotland helping more than 9,000 people into employment. We've established a new child disability payment to replace disability living allowance, establishing a new adult disability payment to replace PIP, and of course we're introducing a brand new child winter heating assistance benefit which will only be available here in Scotland. So there is work that we have done, but there is much more that all governments need to look to do, and of course having research to underpin and inform that work is also always important, so I will certainly look carefully at that suggestion.
Question number 6, Michael Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister whether the Scottish Government will provide an urgent update on its discussions with the EIS after the announcement of new strike dates.
First Minister.
Well, can I say, first of all, these are really difficult times for everyone. That, of course, includes those who work across the different parts of our public sector, and that includes teachers. It's also a difficult time for public spending because of the inflationary impact on the Scottish Government's budget. And it's in that context that I say a fair pay offer has been made to teachers. That's been made as appropriate through the Scottish Negotiating Committee for Teachers. It is of course the case that industrial action is in no one's interest. It is not in the interest of teachers, it's certainly not in the interest of pupils, parents or carers either, who have already of course faced significant disruption over the past 3 years. The Education Secretary is in regular dialogue with all of our teacher unions and spoke with the EIS General Secretary most recently last Friday. These discussions are, of course, ongoing, although the Chamber will be aware that only COSLA, as the employer, can make a formal pay offer to the teacher unions through the SNCT. The Scottish Government does not negotiate separately with unions on teachers' pay.
Michael Mara.
Presiding Officer, the offer that the First Minister describes, that was rejected by teaching unions, was made at the last possible moment. It had sat on the Cabinet Secretary's desk for over 3 weeks. And since the announcement of 16 more EIS strike dates, which will close our schools, deprive our children of their education and throw family life into chaos, no dates for negotiation have been sought or fixed. Next week, the SSTA and NASUWT will strike, closing schools again. No attempt has been made to avert that action by this government. Presiding Officer, our children have lost so much in the pandemic years. How can they afford a government making so little effort to keep their schools open?
First Minister.
Well, that's just, frankly, not the case. The offer that was made to teacher unions last week was the fourth offer that has gone to unions. And I think anybody looks at this government, and bear in mind the point I made about the Scottish Government not negotiating separately with unions, it's through the Scottish Negotiating Committee for Teachers. But anybody who has looked at the efforts this government has made to give fair pay rises and settle any potential for industrial action with the wider local government workforce, with the NHS workforce, will know that this is a government, I think in contrast with other governments in other parts of the UK, that is going to every length possible to reach fair agreements with our public sector trade unions. Looking at the offer made to teachers, again, the fourth offer which has been made, it recognises the impact of the cost crisis on lower paid teachers in particular, with an increase of up to 6.85% for them. The offer is the same as the offer that has already been accepted by other local government workers. And I have nothing but admiration for our teaching profession. They are rightly paid higher than other workers in other parts of the local government workforce. But the offer in terms of a pay increase that has been made to teachers is the same as that already accepted by the janitor in a school or by the dinner lady working in a school. So it is a fair offer. If accepted, it would mean that since 2018, teachers have had a 21.8% cumulative pay increase. And lastly, Presiding Officer, we have the highest starting salary in the UK for a fully qualified teacher. Under this new and latest offer, a newly qualified teacher in Scotland would receive £7,400 more than counterparts in England. Our most experienced classroom teachers get £5,600 more than if they were teaching in England on the main pay range. So I think our record shows our commitment to teachers, and I really hope this is an offer that will be accepted in the interest of teachers and pupils across the country.
Stephanie Callaghan.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister has noted already that strikes are in no one's best interest, not teachers and certainly not pupils. Does the First Minister agree that on a fixed budget the Scottish Government has been put in an impossible position by the UK Government, with no additional support forthcoming to fund pay offers or mitigate the impacts of inflation?
First Minister.
Well, that's a statement of fact, and it is important. It is a statement of fact. It's important to remember that current pay negotiations are for this financial year. And in this financial year, the Scottish Government's budget has been eroded to the tune of £1.7 billion by inflation, and not an additional penny extra has been provided to help deal with that. But we're not standing by and doing nothing. We are working really hard to give our public sector workers a fair pay deal. Take the NHS offer that NHS unions are currently considering, an average of 7.5%. In England, under the Conservatives, in Wales, under Labour, the offer to the NHS is 4.5% on average. So we are doing everything we can to get every penny possible into the pockets of public sector workers, because that's the kind of government we are. That's our values. But yes, we do have a fixed budget, and it's been eroded because of Tory government incompetence.
Willie Rennie.
So that's the message to teachers. Just be grateful. You've had your lot. You're paid enough. That's not the way to treat teachers in this country. Playing one set of workers against another is a disgraceful way to treat those people who taught our young people through the pandemic. Isn't it about time that instead of making last-minute offers, hours before the strike deadline, that she treated teachers with the respect that they are due and gave them a decent pay offer with the budget that she has got?
First Minister.
I know Willie Rennie doesn't get much attention these days, but even by his standards, that was a pretty shameful tone to take on an issue that is so important to teachers, pupils and parents across the country. Let me set out again the way in which we are approaching this. An offer this year that recognises the impact of the cost crisis on the lowest paid teachers, and an offer that is as fair and gives as much of an increase to teachers as the janitor and the dinner lady has already accepted. In a fixed budget, part of what we've got to try to do is to be fair across all parts of the public sector, and that is what we are seeking to do. Secondly, an offer that, if accepted, would mean that since 2018, teachers would have had a 21.8% cumulative pay increase, and I think they deserve every penny of it, and an outcome that would mean that our teachers are paid better than teachers in other parts of the UK. Highest starting salary, not just in the UK, the OECD found that starting salaries for teachers in Scotland are 17% above the EU average at primary level. So that's how much we value teachers. Within a fixed budget, we are doing everything possible to get every penny possible into the pockets of public sector workers. And that's the right thing to do. And that tone, frankly, I think will be seen for what it was by people across Scotland.
Question number 7, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to build on the enduring legacy of Doddy Weir and support efforts to cure MND and similar neurological conditions.
First Minister.
Well, as we've been reflecting earlier today, Doddy Weir was a Scottish sporting legend, and as a human being, I think he was, in so many ways, one of a kind. He was a hero of rugby, but off the pitch, the way he responded to his MND diagnosis was truly inspirational. He campaigned tirelessly to increase awareness of this cruel condition, as well as raising money for research through his foundation in the hope that a cure will be found so that others coming after him would benefit from that. We, and I suspect I'm not just speaking for the government here, I'm speaking for everybody across the chamber, we share Doddy's vision of a world without MND. Since 2015, and this has been inspired, and I think it is important to say it, much of the work we did after 2015 was inspired by the campaigning of the late Gordon Aikman, who also deserves great credit here. But we have invested around £700,000 in research looking at the progression of the condition and the development of a pipeline for new treatments. We've also doubled the number of MND specialist nurses across the country and ensured that they're funded now from and by the NHS, and we're currently implementing the neurological care and support framework to ensure that everyone with a neurological condition such as MND can access the coordinated and high quality care that they need.
Brian Whittle.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer? I think to say that Doddy was a unique individual certainly undersells him. I don't think we should forget that he was a world-class sportsman, but it is his indomitable character and the way he tackled his diagnosis of MND head-on that will endure, and he certainly showed us how to live your best life. As many have said, you could not fail to like him if you met him and be inspired by him, and certainly I can think of no one who could possibly achieve what he has. And along with Rob Burrows, he has brought the search for treatment and cure of MND into everyone's thoughts. I'm very welcome to hear the First Minister mention the work of Gordon Aikman before that. The UK Government have pledged £50 million to help in the search for MND treatments, and although the messages are positive, can I ask the First Minister and the Chamber to unify as a Parliament to encourage the UK Government to move quicker? And specifically, what will the Scottish Government do to work with charities like My Name's Doddy to tackle these horrible neurological conditions and keep up the momentum that the big man started?
I think
First Minister.
We've all mentioned, the practical impact of the work Doddy did, and indeed Gordon before him. But what always struck me about Doddy and Gordon was the courageous way in which they never allowed that horrible condition and the diagnosis of it to dim their spirit and their love for and capacity for life. I think the last time I saw Doddy in person was at Murrayfield, and his smile lit up the room. And You know, that fortitude and resilience in the face of something that I don't think any of us really know how we would cope with is utterly inspirational. And it united Doddy and Gordon, and in their memory, we all have a duty to go as far and as fast as we possibly can to find the cure for this condition. So yes, I would encourage the UK Government to go faster, but I also would say to my Government we need to go faster and do everything we can here, and we need to work together. We already work closely with charitable organisations, and we will continue to do that. There are positive signs thanks to the research that is being done, but we need to make sure that we support those who have the skills and the expertise to find the cure, that they have all of the necessary support and resources to do that. And I pledge today, in memory of the great Doddy Weir, that the Government I lead will continue to do all we can to find the cure that he so desperately wanted.
Thank you. That concludes First Minister's questions. I would say that I regret that I've been unable to call any general or constituency questions today, due largely to the length of some exchanges, and I will review today's exchanges to ensure that more members are able to participate in this session each week. Thank you. There will be a brief suspension to allow members and the public gallery before we move on to members' business.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.